In this episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast, we're going to be talking about the paleo diet. We're going to be talking about some entrepreneurship, starting a blog, writing books, all kinds of great stuff that my guest, Steph, has done. So, first off, Steph, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So, let's get started with your story. How did you get involved in the paleo diet? How did you get involved in starting this blog? How'd that all come about?
Yeah, actually, I just had my 7-year anniversary of the day that I sort of went paleo because I remember I marked it on my calendar. But it was sort of like 2009, 2010. I was racing mountain bikes, and friends of mine were like, hey, we're going to try this thing called the paleo diet. These are friends that I was racing with, and I thought, okay, that sounds kind of weird, but what is it? And they're like, well, you don't eat any gluten, you don't eat any grains. And as somebody who's an endurance athlete at the time, that sounded really weird because we're used to, carb heavy dinners and pasta dinner and bagels in the morning and that sort of thing. So I was sort of curious / skeptical, but I read a book called The Paleo Diet for Athletes, which was written by Dr. Cordain and an endurance coach called Joe Friel. And I recognized Joe Friel's name, and I thought, all right, well, I'm listening. And so I sort of read that book and then decided to have my holiday fun. And in January of 2010, just sort of went for it. And, it was an adjustment like anything else. And the way I ate back then isn't exactly the way I eat now. I was a lot more sort of rigid and didn't understand the role of my own needs and bio-individuality in the way I was eating. But, we still eat pretty much a paleo template with some modifications based on our needs. So, I started that journey, and I always loved to cook, and I would get together, we would get together with our friends and have these sort of mountain bike weekends, and I would cook or I would bring something with me as a recipe, and people would always ask, what's the recipe for that? And so I started putting recipes on my personal blog, and somebody along the way, I wish I remember who it was because I think I owe them a debt of gratitude, said, you should just start a food blog. And I thought, all right. And now at the time I was teaching high school science. I taught for a total of 12 years. And so I was just, had my teaching job and would put recipes on my fun little hobby blog, when I had the chance to cook and take photos with my little point and shoot camera and stuff like that. And after doing that for a little while, I thought, I really like this. And people in my life were coming to me and saying, like, you've made this big change. Like, how did you do it? And can you give me advice? And so I started to realize that I really did have a passion for teaching other people about nutrition. And so I eventually left the classroom in June of 2013 and took Stupid Easy Paleo as a hobby blog and turned it into a website. And the rest is sort of history.
That is awesome. So, I'm personally a fan of the paleo diet, but why the paleo diet for you?
Yeah, I have tried so many different things, and I left out, there's a huge amount of backstory that I didn't talk about. But, even though I was racing mountain bikes at a pretty high level, I wasn't pro or anything, but I was spending a lot of time on my bike. I had a lot of body image issues, and anybody who's seen photos of me knows that I'm kind of a muscular chick, and I was always like, I just want to be smaller, because in mountain biking and in cycling, you're moving your own body weight against gravity, and the goal is to be sort of as light but as powerful as you can be. So I spent a lot of time trying to do a lot of things dietarily to make myself as small as possible. I was a vegetarian for a while, which really didn't work for my system. My digestion was crazy at that point, but I was like, I'm trying to just like go leaner and, cut back on what I was eating. And I've done all sorts of, sort of diets along the way, but I still didn't feel great. But, I think there's a tendency for people when they don't feel great for a long period of time, they just sort of think, well, this is normal for me. This is how it's supposed to be. And so when I went paleo and sort of shifted my diet away from processed food and grain heavy types of nutrition and started to add in more animal protein and stuff like that, I just started to feel better. you know, I always tell the story. I would leave school every day, and I would drive past a 7-Eleven that was right down the street from school, and I would get Coke Zero and M&Ms, and that was my afternoon snack. And that was to keep me awake because I wasn't sleeping well. Um, I was always really low energy. I mean, I would get hangry. I would get drowsy after I ate. My digestion was weird. Just I would get bloated. And so probably a couple months into paleo and beyond, that stuff started to resolve. And so for me, that was all the proof that I needed that it was working for my body. Now, like I said, I made some mistakes along the way, and I think one of the things I was doing was still trying to sort of eat really small portions to keep my body mass really small, and not eating enough carbohydrate because everybody thinks, okay, paleo is great for fat loss, but as somebody who was riding and racing for hours and hours and hours a week, I just wasn't eating enough food. And then I did a season of triathlon, and it's really hard to keep on top of your caloric intake with that much exercise. And so, I sort of had this before and after picture of me. I have a picture of me in 2010, about 6 months after I started paleo, but I was in the middle of triathlon season, and I just was really, I was really small. My muscle mass was sort of wasting away because my body was consuming my own muscle mass for fuel. And so, I've made my share of blunders, and I've gone through this learning process, but ultimately for me, the proof is in how I feel every day. And being paleo has allowed me to do things like get off of hormonal birth control. And I have a condition called endometriosis, and it's allowed me to manage my endometriosis without heavy medication or other interventions. So for me, like there's sort of a pseudo autoimmune component to just eating healthier, reducing the amount of sugar in my diet, reducing the amount of inflammatory foods, and just sort of taking a more nourishing approach. So, for me, that's still, I still feel great, every day, and that's all the motivation I need to just keep going.
So you said earlier that you do paleo, but with some modifications, and you talked
Yeah.
about like eating more carbohydrates. Is there other modifications?
If we're in a really heavy training cycle, so right now I do Olympic weightlifting. It depends what time of the year. Sometimes we're in like a heavy training cycle leading up to a meet. If that's the case, then I usually need a little bit more protein than even sort of my baseline. And I get a good amount of protein every day. But if that's the case, sometimes I'll have a protein shake post-workout. Occasionally we'll eat rice as post-workout carbs, white rice. We eat potatoes, which is like a no-no on a strict paleo diet. But, I think when you sort of look at my carb intake versus the average paleo eater, I think a lot of people have started to embrace fats in the paleo community, but they're still really scared of carbs. And carb intake is really personal. If somebody is sort of working to, if they have symptoms of like prediabetes and insulin resistance, they're probably going to want to cut their carb intake quite low until their body is able to properly process those carbohydrates. Somebody like me who's more active, I'm relatively lean and healthy and strong, and I work out, 4 days a week. For me, like having a little bit of extra carbohydrate actually helps my body stay in a much more fueled and sort of recovered state. So, I always I do these nutrition webinars every once in a while, and it's probably really frustrating to people who listen because I'm like, when it comes to nutrition, we have these sort of like blanket statements that apply to a lot of people and these sort of best practices. But when it comes down to the nuance, it depends on you and your context and your goals and what you're dealing with now and where you want to go. And I think that's where people get a little bit stuck with paleo is they think it's just one specific prescription. And it's not. It can't be if you're going to do it long term. And it can't be if you're going to need to take into account your own individuality. And I think that's really, really important for people to sort of know is like, it might be a great starting point, but I think most of the people who are, bloggers and experts in the community and stuff like that, if you ask them, do you eat strict paleo, according to like the paleo diet, yes and no list, they'd probably say no because they've learned how to modify things for their own needs. So I think that's a common trap and something people have to be a little bit aware of.
So if the listeners wanted to go try, let's say, paleo, what would their breakfast, lunch, dinner look like?
It really depends. I mean, I recommend protein, veggies, and fat at every meal. Um, I recommend a starting point as 3 or 4 meals a day. I think some people are like, I need to eat every 2 hours. Like, I need 6 meals a day, or I can only eat once a day because I have to be fasting. And I think for most humans, they work better when they take a more sort of moderate approach to start and then perhaps push the boat in one direction or another. So for us, that looks like, some kind of leftover for us. For this is what we eat. I'm not speaking for everybody here, but we do some sort of like sausages or leftover meat for breakfast, along with some kind of usually bone broth and veggies. And sometimes I'll have a little bit of potato or sweet potato. And then lunch is kind of like on repeat. It's some kind of meat or eggs. It's some kind of veggies. If it's post-workout, it's a little bit of extra carbohydrate and some healthy fats. And then dinner is a repeat of that. So, you can certainly get kind of creative within that. But I think sometimes people try to get a little bit too clever and get overwhelmed with cooking, And so I just sort of recommend, stick with the basics, keep it really simple. For breakfast, eggs are really easy for a lot of people, and they're quick. Like somebody was saying this morning, I don't have time to cook breakfast, and I'm like, it literally takes 5 minutes to make eggs. I'm not gonna let you off the hook with that. And I know not everybody likes eggs or can eat them, but we had a period of time where my husband couldn't eat eggs either because of his histamine intolerance, and so we would have to do sort of like make a big batch of pulled pork. And for him, we would have to freeze it to sort of stop the histamine from accumulating. But you have this like defrost this delicious pulled pork, have it with a sweet potato and some, spinach or whatever veggies on the side. And that's breakfast. So I think if we can sort of get away from the idea of like, it has to be breakfast food, it can be anything for breakfast. And especially in America, we have this notion of what breakfast is supposed to be. It's supposed to be some like sugary pseudo dessert almost, like muffins or something along those lines. And that just doesn't really work for paleo. And I'm not saying you can't make paleo baked goods, but just as a sort of something for people to think about, like they tend to be really high in fat. They tend to be expensive because nut flours and stuff like that are kind of pricey, and they're just not really filling. They sort of lack the protein that keeps people satiated and moving through their day. So there's some things to think about there, but I just always default back to that template: protein, veggies, and healthy fats. And you just put that on repeat.
Other than obviously avocados, what are some other examples of healthy fats that you like to eat?
Yeah, any kind of coconut product like coconut milk, coconut oil, coconut flakes, coconut butter, any kind of olives or olive products, so like whole olives, olive oil, obviously avocados, avocado oil, that's all really well and good. Nuts and seeds, you kind of want to use those a little bit more sparingly just because they do tend to be high in pro-inflammatory omegas. So you just want to, keep that on, just keep it on the sort of even keel. Sometimes people will be like, I'm paleo, so that means I can eat like half a jar of almond butter and it doesn't matter. And I'm like, well, fat, like things like nuts and seeds and, coconut and olives and avocado, we need healthy fats, but we also have to remember that like a gram of fat has more than twice the calories compared to a gram of carbohydrate or protein. So it's easier to eat a lot of caloric intake from fats. Now, calories aren't the only thing that matters when it comes to food, but I just want people to kind of think about fats as like an enhancement, a topping, an accompaniment, a condiment that you would add onto. So, for example, if you had, let's say you made I made this the other day, a Cobb salad. So we had a really nice bed of greens with some veggies and some roasted salmon on top of that. And then, sprinkled a little bit of crumbled bacon or, sprinkle on some chopped nuts or something like that, where it becomes an enhancement. There's crunch, there's a little bit of extra flavor, but it's not the main star of the meal. So nuts and seeds obviously in there. And then you have sort of like animal fats and other plant fats for cooking. So animal fats, you have pastured lard, you have ghee, which is a type of butter that's had the milk proteins removed. So it's sort of like a clarified butter, which works for a lot of people that have sensitivities to other forms of dairy. There's chicken fat and tallow, and there's all sorts of stuff. So I think sometimes people want to default to the plant oils, and that's great. Like that's a great place to start, but it's not the only thing that you have access to. So I just kind of encourage people to try new things and mix it up and see what's out there. Because you never know, you might find something that you really like.
And if someone wanted to try out, let's say they wanted to get a little bit fancy, and obviously you have a lot of really great recipes on your site, but if there's only like one or two that you'd say start with these, what would they be?
Ooh, I hate to say this because I have a recipe website, but I think if you can learn techniques over recipes, then your possibilities become unlimited. For example, I have a recipe on my site for pomegranate beef, which is a braised cut of like a chuck roast. So it's it's a meat that would be kind of on the tough side. It needs to be slow cooked and like loved and, it needs some massaging. So you would, take that cut of meat and sear it on both sides and put it in a Dutch oven with some liquid in a low oven, say 300 degrees for about 3 hours. And you get this sort of tender, fall apart meat. And so that's a great recipe that I really love, but that technique can be applied to, I just made the other day a pork shoulder with sort of like a pressed apple juice as the braising liquid. And then the juice reduces and gets kind of thick and caramely and the meat is fall apart tender. And you can repeat that like technique with a lot of different things. So I think I really encourage people to learn, like recipes are a great starting point, but where the kitchen really becomes, you become the master of the kitchen is where you can look at a pile of random ingredients and say, I can make something delicious out of this and I don't need to follow a recipe. So, that would be an example, would be the pomegranate beef. I really love soup. It's sort of a bias of mine, but again, I have a recipe on the site called creamy broccoli soup. It's actually dairy free, but it's been nicknamed, not by me, by my readers, as crack soup because it's just so delicious, but it's got such simple, humble ingredients. It's leek and onion and broccoli and bone broth and a little bit of coconut milk. And it sounds so, you're like, it couldn't be that good. And people are like, I just stand over the pot and eat it right out of the pot because it's so tasty. So, I think when you can learn to swap things in and out and use those basic techniques, then you become the master, right? Like you don't have to rely on a recipe, or if you run out of an ingredient, you know how to make a substitution and you don't have to worry so much about sticking to an ingredient list. So those are a few of my favorites.
Awesome. I want to transition more into the entrepreneurial journey at this point. One of the big questions I have for you, and you kind of briefly touched on how you started your website, but
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit more about the transition from starting the website to actually being able to turn it into a full-time thing,
Mm.
which that's awesome to me.
it was a process that was fraught with a lot of trial and error. I think so the website was a wordpress.com blog, which is a free, WordPress hosted space on the internet, and you can choose your template. And probably back then, in 2011, the options were a lot more limited than they are now, but you have a lot of limitations for that kind of a blog. It's a great starting point for people, because when you transition into something that's you need to do sort of a self-hosted instead of a WordPress hosted website or whatever other platform you're on, that increases not only the complexity but the cost. And so if people are just starting out, I really recommend them just like set up your space online. Don't be too worried about what it looks like, and just start sharing your content with the world, whether it's recipes or photos or blog entries or whatever. Like, just start sharing your stuff. And social media platforms are great. So I know a lot of people that have started they had a social media account and it got popular, and then they were like, maybe I should have a website that goes with this. And then they made the website later. I don't think that's a wrong approach. I just want to like remind people that you don't own social media, and you can't control what the powers that be decide to do with that platform. So just a little, sort of cautionary tale, but we started as wordpress.com, just a simple blog, and then we transitioned over to a more functional website. And with, we can run plugins and customize it to do e-commerce and stuff like that. And honestly, that process was very slow. We started, I didn't like rebrand with a new logo and sort of like a formal logo until a year later, once I had made that switch. So, and a lot of people get really worried about the branding and the logo and the look and the aesthetic. And again, that's all well and good, but that's going to cost you money if you get a good quality job. And it's just not, for me, I'm like, just start sharing, because maybe you won't even like it. You think like blogging is going to be great, and then you start doing it and you're like, it's not my favorite thing. And really, if you want to build a good following, you need consistency. Not every day, but you need to show up consistently and give value to people and teach them and share your stuff with them. And so a lot of people get really wrapped up in the details and the technicalities, and they try to get really just too complex too quickly, I think, and instead of focusing on the quality of what they're doing, the quality of the content, the quality of the recipes or the photos or whatever it is. And so I just recommend for people to kind of don't get in over your head. It's easy to spend thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on website design and branding and logos and all that sort of stuff. Just sort of like, it's okay to grow slow. It's okay to grow in a way that's organic to you. And these days, I think there's a perception among bloggers that if you're just starting out now, it's too late. And I don't agree with that, because there are more and more people getting online every day. The world is more internet connected all the time. And nobody is going to have your own unique point of view and perspective and skills. And even within a market like paleo, even within a real food community or whatever, CrossFit or whatever your interest and passion is, there's always room. And so I think to just sort of know that it's okay to grow in a way that's comfortable for you. I get a lot of new people who come to me and they're like, but I need to have like this many followers already, and I don't. And I'm like, that's great. But the other thing is you want the space and the freedom to be able to make mistakes and try things out. And when you have hundreds of thousands of people following you, that becomes a little bit more tricky, right? There's more at stake. And so I just always sort of caution people to not be in too much of a hurry, to let things unfold as they will. And so that's why for a year and a half, I had my blog and I was teaching full time. And so I would make recipes on the weekend and photograph them on the weekend. And then sometimes I would type up blog posts like, during the week once I got home from work and stuff like that. But it's okay. You can go slow or you can go at your own pace. And you can still end up building something that you're really proud of and that serves people and that's representative of the things that you're really passionate about.
Do you remember the first dollar you made from the site? And if so, how did that come about?
Yes, I do. It was from Amazon affiliates.
Mm.
So one of the first thing I did when I could monetize the website was I signed up for an Amazon affiliate account. And so I think that was the first income I ever made. And I also had signed up for like a Google AdSense account. And even though I had sort of enabled that at the same time, you don't make your ad money until a couple months later, usually once once all the books close for those different cycles and stuff. So yeah, I think the first money I made was from Amazon.
And then, did you ever see any really big uptakes or upticks in the traffic to the website, or has it been just a steady, constant growth?
Traffic is sometimes the bane of my existence. It's really interesting. So at least from what I see, and I've seen other metrics of this. I mean, they're not like scientific by any means, but I've seen stuff like a sort of a compilation of data from Reddit and a compilation of data from other searches and stuff like that. That paleo has decreased in popularity compared to say 2014. So 2014, the beginning of 2014 especially, was the traffic was crazy. Like we had really great traffic. And the beginning of the year is always much busier than the middle or the end of the year, as you can imagine, with the type of website that I have, people sort of recommitting to eating better and looking for recipes and that sort of stuff. But I think over the years, we've seen it just growth. We haven't been growing tremendously. Things have kind of been hanging out where they normally, they've been for the last couple of years. And after 2014, I think there was a point in early 2014 when we were hitting almost 1 million page views a month. And we're nowhere near that now, just to sort of be really truthful about that. And so it's been a really interesting process to watch the community and not necessarily the amount of people who are sort of loyal paleo followers, but just sort of like people who are curious and who are looking for paleo recipes and stuff like that. I think it's just gone down. And, we've seen the rise in popularity of other types of diets and stuff like that. And I think you're just seeing a normal contraction of what's there. Now, we also do have really good organic traffic, say from Google searches, because the site's been around for a long time. We have decent SEO. I don't have an SEO expert on, first of all, I don't even really have a team. I have a virtual assistant and my husband who helps me out part-time when I need something. Like, that's it. So there's no giant team. There's no like specialists that work for me. And, in terms of SEO and stuff like that, it's just been learning as I go and trying to do good work there and trying to make sure, we're getting links and that's it. And so we do have pretty good organic traffic. Some of our social channels do pretty well. Obviously, things like Pinterest work really well with recipes and pretty photos. So that's our number one social traffic would be from Pinterest. So it's a mixture of different things. And I just think, I don't know where the future of it is going. It's not going to disappear, but I think the days of like explosive growth are kind of over. And there's just also a lot more websites now who are doing paleo stuff. In 2011, that wasn't exactly the case. I think I could count on two hands how many websites I knew existed that were doing paleo recipes. So it's changed a lot. And so there's just more places for people to sort of niche down and find out who's offering recipes that really jives not only with their nutritional needs, but with their life view and their personality and who they are, a resonance of who that person is and the things they value. I think it's much easier for people to find that now. And so, you know, stupid easy paleo is probably not for everyone, and that's okay. But we have a great group of people and a great community, regardless of that.
Do you think the paleo diet will eventually kind of go the way of like Atkins in the sense where it's like still around and people still know about it, but it's not as common to hear people say, "Oh, I'm following an Atkins diet" as it was 10 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are realizing that quote paleo, like the trademarked paleo diet and the way people eat in their normal everyday life, if they're going to do this for more than a couple months, it's going to be a shade of gray
Mm.
of that original sort of like strict diet. And so I think you have a lot of people who used paleo as a gateway to exploring, a more sort of real whole food approach to their nutrition and other lifestyle factors, to be quite honest, because we know diet can only take you so far. And so I think you're going to find that people are living like a we've got like an infinite spectrum of sort of shades of gray of what paleo looks like. And I think what hurt paleo a lot was this caveman dealio, and like caveman memes and caveman this and the caveman diet. And I think it really took what at heart is a very well meaning, very holistic, and, you know, um, sound way of eating for a lot of people. And it reduced it to sort of a fad and a laughing point. And, something that people saw as just like, no, like they just dismissed it because I'm not doing caveman. That's ridiculous. And so I think a lot of that hurt the community. And I think you're still seeing a lot of people that are interested in it. I don't think it's going to disappear, but I think what I've seen from some fellow bloggers is just the need to sort of unpigeonhole themselves. And I feel a lot of that too. I'm like, I want to be able to talk about potatoes and talk about other things that aren't strict paleo without people automatically pointing the finger and saying that's not paleo, and then we have to have a discussion about it, which is fine. But I think you're going to find that a lot of people are going to shift just what they call it. And that's the blessing and the curse about labels, is that it helps you to identify with people or things that are, sort of a construct, a way of looking at the world. But we all know that there's nuance in everything. And so labels can only take you so far. And so I think, the Atkins diet is a very different way of looking at nutrition, not just in terms of what you eat, but it's sort of like, the trademarked paleo diet and the Atkins diet are very specific protocols, very specific things to eat and not to eat. And I think most people can't live that way for a long period of time. So I don't think it's going to disappear 100%. I just think you might see fewer people calling it that. And or I really hope the caveman thing just dies, because it's really hurt those of us who are teaching about it. But it's also hurt people who genuinely need to change their health and get ridiculed and mocked by people around them. Like, you're doing that stupid caveman thing, come on. Or like, that's just a fad. It's bad for your health. Like, there's always, there's always a way to look at things from a different perspective. And so I just hope that aspect of paleo goes away.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I don't know if I know the strict definition of paleo. To me, in the way I eat, is basically if it was around before the agricultural revolution, then it's okay. So to me, it's basically no processed food and no grains or dairy. I just don't eat much dairy. And to me, and I had this argument with someone like, well, that's not healthy. I'm like, wait a minute, are you saying I should eat processed food? Or are you saying
Hmm.
like I need to eat grains? And the person that I was arguing with had no idea. They're like, well, my parents are doctors. And I'm like, that doesn't make you a qualified person to argue this.
Hmm.
She's like, oh, you can't get enough vegetables. I'm like, I don't think you know what we're talking about anymore. It was just
Yeah.
like, and I get a lot of that kind of stuff when so at some points, I'm like, all right, maybe the strict paleo is too much saturated fat. I'm not even sure.
Mhm.
I'm not anti-saturated fat by any means, but I could see how people could take it overboard. But
Well, I think you had things like bacon. Everybody thinks that everyone who eats paleo is eating a pound of bacon a day, and that's just
right,
it just doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it's the same thing with like I make paleo desserts every day. Like some people will do that for a period of time until they realize it's actually still dessert, it's actually still a lot of sugar and a lot of fat. And, special occasions aside, that those extreme things like I'm going to eat a pound of bacon for breakfast might be associated with paleo, but they're not really the way most people operate when it comes to that stuff. So, there's a lot of assumption about what it is without really understanding it. So yeah, people will often say, well, you don't eat any vegetables, and I'm like, okay.
yeah,
Come see what our fridge looks like. I think you would disagree, but just like I really just want to stress this: any dietary paradigm can be done poorly or well.
right,
Vegetarianism can be done very poorly, veganism can be done very poorly. Whatever your cup of tea can be done really poorly if you're eating processed food and sort of nutrient poor food and stuff like that, even if it technically fits the rules.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, we'll bring it back to the writing books, but I guess got to tell this story very quickly. And I had a friend, a roommate actually, who was vegetarian, but his diet consisted of pizza and French fries. And I'm like,
yeah,
you can't think that's healthy. Like, I
yeah,
think a little bit of meat with some vegetables would be way better. But yeah,
yeah, yeah. I used to work with a girl who was a vegetarian, and I think she was from Wisconsin. So take this for what it is, but I think 90% of her diet was cheese. So, God bless her, but
yeah.
I just feel like there's always going to be a way to do something well and poorly. So.
I want to talk about you writing books a little bit, and then we'll start to wrap it up. But I'm very curious about
Mm.
your process. What was the first book that you wrote, and how did that process come about? How hard or easy was that? I'm assuming it was more hard than it was easy.
The first book I wrote was The Paleo Athlete, which I decided to write because at the time I was CrossFitting competitively, and I saw an interesting situation where paleo and CrossFit actually went back a long way. Like there's like a long history there between the two of those two things. And at some point there was sort of a falling out between the hires up and the powers that be in CrossFit and some of the people within the community who were really pro paleo. And so CrossFit sort of moved away from a paleo diet in a lot of ways and started recommending things like the zone, which, if you use standard zone recommendations, is really low on calories. So it's really an interesting departure. But in any case, being a CrossFit athlete who primarily is eating a paleo diet, I just saw a lot of people who were super confused and trying to be, for example, less than 50 grams of carbs a day, but then they're training 4 to 6 days a week with intensity. I'm not just saying like they're going out for a walk, like they're doing high intensity exercise. And so their carb levels were just too low. And so I started to look around and think, the Paleo Diet for Athletes by Dr. Cordain, that was the book that got me involved in eating this way, had a very strong emphasis on endurance sports and not as much inclusion with sports that were high intensity in nature or power generation in nature. So I decided to write The Paleo Athlete as a way to sort of include other people like me who felt like the paleo community wasn't really talking to me when I would see these nutrition recommendations. It was almost all geared toward endurance stuff. And so that was the first thing that I really did when I quit my job. I actually moved to Scotland to be with my then fiance, now husband. And we, I kind of like sat in a Scottish flat for the fall and wrote this book. And, would like have my little routine of going to the gym and squatting and whatever, and coming home and writing. And that was what I did for about 3 months. And so then I released that book in ebook format, although I still get requests to put it in print. I know that me knowing myself, I would want to like rewrite the whole thing. So I'm sort of putting that on the back burner. So that was the first one that I wrote. And then a year later, I came out with the Performance Paleo Cookbook, which was sort of the companion to the nutrition recommendations, and talking about like how can you use, so in the Paleo Athlete, talking about how you can use paleo in different ways and still stay, relatively true to the core, but with modifications to support your training. And the Performance Paleo Cookbook was like, okay, now that we know the theory, here's the food to help you do it. And so that book came out in print in 2015. And so I worked on that for, let's say like 4 months of 2014. And then the book was released the next year. So those are the 2 books. And then, I don't know, I have the itch to write another one. And I'm sort of in the beginning process of working with my publisher to establish what that's going to be.
So it kind of leads me into the next question, which is, what are your plans for the blog, for everything, for your business in 2017?
Oh my goodness. That's a huge question. So I actually, last year I started a personally branded website called stephgodrow.com, which is where I do a lot of writing on strength, and it's particularly geared toward women, so physical and mental strength. And so a lot of the stuff that I write about that's sort of more real talk is there. And then of course I have Stupid Easy Paleo, which is where more of the recipes live, and the podcast and stuff like that. My coming year, I need to decide what to do with those 2 entities, whether or not to merge them and rebrand Stupid Easy Paleo as my own name, and just fold that in as a component of what I do, because while food is really important to me and I love to photograph it and talk about nutrition, it's one piece of the puzzle, and so I've got those 2 sort of things to deal with. I also have a 6-week program called the Harder to Kill Challenge, which is really encompasses the 4 pillars of health as I see it, trying to help people get back on their feet. And that also lives at Stupid Easy Paleo. So, just sort of deciding what to do with all that stuff. And the challenge runs all the time, and we have a great community there. I'm sort of in the beginning process of creating year 2 of my Women's Strength Summit. So last year we ran the summit, and that was a huge success. And just, such a gratifying experience to hear women from all around the world who participated in that and just said, wow, this is like the breath of fresh air we've been looking for, because women online are, especially in the health and fitness communities, are pigeonholed a lot into a very specific way of looking and being. And we know that real women come in all different shapes and sizes and goals and stuff like that. So that was a really fun event, and I'm planning to rerun that this year. I think tentatively May. So we'll see. There's a lot of stuff in the mix. For now, it's just sort of a continued focus on helping people navigate this journey of health and looking at it from all those different perspectives, knowing that food and nourishment is part of it, but it's a great place to get started, but it can't be the only thing that you do if you want to get your life back together. And so helping people work in those other things like moving and strengthening your body, managing your energy, and working on your mindset, because that's a huge one. for people is really getting their minds in the right place. So a lot of things, not a lot of clear answers right now, but we're still in January, so keeping the options open.
Steph, I have one last question for you, and it's a much more general question, and that is if you had to give some advice to all the 20 something people listening to this podcast right now, what kind of advice would you give them?
Hmm.
It's a big one.
Yeah, so I'm about to turn 38, and I look back at where I was when I was 28 or even in my early 20s. And I guess I would say, in general, like, don't worry so much. Um, I think when you're in your 20s, there's a lot of pressure to figure things out, and to like be grown up and to have your path all blazed for you. And I think that causes people, at least it caused me, to make some decisions that I don't regret them because my life is amazing. And, like the you can't know what the path is going to be ahead of time. But I made some decisions at the time that I didn't feel, looking back, were in line with what I really wanted. And so I think there's a huge pressure to like, you know, um, graduate from college or like do your gap year or whatever, and then like get the perfect job and settle down and do all the things you're supposed to do. And I think sometimes people give up a lot of themselves in the process when they're in their 20s. And then a lot of people, at least people like me, have this kind of renaissance in their 30s where they're like, wait a minute, I'm doing everything that I'm, quote, supposed to be doing, but it's kind of killing me. It's killing my soul. And, I think about being almost 40 and I don't feel like it, but I think about being sort of like almost 40 and just wanting to express myself and do the things, do things of value in the world and help other people. And I think when you're in your 20s, a lot of the focus tends to be on yourself. And a lot of my clients, and even myself, when I was in my 20s, I just wanted to have like the perfect body, have the perfect whatever. And I think when you get a little bit older, you start to realize that that stuff doesn't matter as much. It's a really interesting shift, at least I think for women in their 30s, to go, yeah, like that perfect body that I'm trying to hammer myself into, it like, even if I get it, am I going to be happy? And what am I giving up to get there? So I think there's like a huge focus on aesthetics. There's a huge focus on doing what you're supposed to be doing, in life. And I would just urge people to follow your own path and not worry so much. Things are going to be okay. Things are going to work out. But sometimes the tighter you hold on to trying to make it work out in a specific way, the harder it is, the more you get closed off. So don't sweat the small stuff, and enjoy yourself. You have to enjoy life because you never know. All we have is right now.
That's great advice, Steph. Steph, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. And if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter. And I release a new video every Monday. And by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.